Hello and welcome to this little Deadly Premonition impression video, and I would like to share with you my thoughts and impression on the game Deadly Premonition after completing the main campaign, which took me around 25 hours. I'm not completely sure on which difficulty I played on, but I would guess that I played on the normal difficulty. Okie dokie. So this game is very much a story-driven game, and in it you get to play as a quite eccentric FBI agent who is sent to a small town to investigate a murder case. Sadly though, there aren't any investigation mechanics in the gameplay, and the gameplay is basically divided into you fighting stuff and driving around and chilling in the town. But before I get into the gameplay, I should mention the state of the PC version, and that is pretty bad. To be perfectly clear, I did install a mod to make the game run at 1920 1080p, because the game doesn't support that at its own. So that mod might have made the game state more unstable than it already was. That is a possibility. But the game is quite notorious for being a shitty PC port, and I experienced a multitude of crashes and different lightning bugs and so on. So yeah, that's not very good. And the game also suffers from some quite annoying menus and the like that really shouldn't exist on a PC version, which makes checking your inventory or checking the map and so on a lot more annoying than it should be. Okay, but let's start with the story, considering that is what the game does best. So, if you have seen Twin Peaks, you might see some resemblance, especially in the early part of the game. And as I mentioned before, you play as an eccentric, coffee-loving FBI agent who is sent to a small town in the middle of nowhere to investigate the murder of a young woman. Now, sadly, we do not get a whole lot of video games with a story like this, and I found the story to be quite fresh, and it's very much a character-driven story, and I found the story and its characters to be quite engaging and so on. The story and the characters are quite intentionally bizarre and a bit weird, and some people might be put off by that, but if you are like me, then you will probably enjoy it quite a lot. Another thing that I thought was a bit sad is that the story is very much a linear story. Despite it being a video game, you don't really have much input on the story or how the characters interact and so on, which, you know, have its own advantages and disadvantages. You know, the advantages, it's naturally that they can create a much more compelling story with set characters and so on. But still, I think it's a bit sad that you can't interact more with the story. Because even if the developers didn't want to branch out the stories depending on your choices, they could still implement it with dialogue trees when you interview suspects and so on. And even though that perhaps is a false interactivity, since it's very limited interactivity, it would still make you, the player, feel involved in the investigation and not just watching this character investigating. It still works as it is, but I think it's kind of sad that the story and the character interactions aren't more interactive. Okay, but enough about the story, let's talk a bit about the gameplay. So, the way this game is set up is that you have this big hub area, that is the town that you're in. And the way it works is that the game has its own day and night cycle, and you can drive around in this hub area and visit places and sleep and eat and go fishing and so on. And the missions in the game are also accessed through the hub area, and usually they are only available at specific times at the day. Okay, so are there any fun stuff to do in the hub area? Well, not really. Fishing is fun. I like fishing in video games. I think it's a great pastime. But beside that, there really isn't a whole lot of things to do. Occasionally there are some side missions, but they are quite few, and the game world does overall feel quite lifeless and stale. And another thing that annoyed me a bit is that the missions are only available at specific times. And the problem with this is that you can't sleep everywhere and you can only sleep in specific intervals. So it's possible that you have to sit and wait for the mission to start, and sitting and waiting in a video game is never all that fun. I mean, you would think that if you attempted to access a mission earlier than you were supposed to, the game would ask you, would you want to wait here for the mission to start? But no, it just, no, return later. And I found myself having to leave the computer and do something else for a couple of minutes. So yeah, they could probably have implemented that one a bit better. Okay, so in the hub world, your main means of transportation is by car. And the positive things about the car is that you can buy different cars and you can upgrade your cars to a certain extent. The sad thing is that the cars control absolutely terrible. I mean, really, really shitty, and that is kind of sad considering how much time you are spending driving the vehicles. But besides driving, you're probably going to spend most of your time in the missions. The missions in the game are, for the most part, made up by combat sections. The game do have some puzzles at some occasions, but they are quite simple and easy, and there are so few of them, so they're hardly worth mentioning. But the combat sections are kind of a mixed bag. Mechanically, the combat works okay. I mean, I'm not really into the whole stand still to shoot and reload and hit things and stuff like that, but I can understand why they do it to limit your movements and so on. But the combat, mechanic-wise is okay. It's nothing spectacular or absolutely not above average, but it works okay. The aiming can be a bit wonky from time to time, but they can explain that you are not the world's best sharpshooter, so you can forgive that, at least in my opinion. But the problem with the combat is that, well, firstly, just how much of it there is. There is quite a lot of combat in the game. And the problem with this is that the mechanics are okay, they're not great, and they get old. And the second biggest problem is the enemy. The enemy variety is absolutely terrible. There is an abysmal small amount of enemies in the game. And most of the enemies behave very samey as well, so it gets old really fast. Not to mention that the standard enemy are these slow walking types, and they work okay, but yeah, you get tired of them after a while. And the third problem is that the combat sections are, for the most part, very separated from the story. The charm from the characters are still there, but story-wise, the combat areas are very much totally separated from the story in itself. And when you are really into the story, want the story to progress and see what happens, then it becomes kind of annoying when you have to play through a combat area that has very little to do with the story in itself. And it doesn't help that quite a lot of the environments you are fighting in are actually kind of boring, not to mention that they pretty much have the same visual style. It's a normal interior building with a lot of roofs everywhere, and nothing wrong with that in itself, but they keep reusing it and reusing it and so on, and it gets kind of dull. And another big problem with the combat in the game is that they have quite a lot of QuickTime events. Now, I'm not a big fan of any kind of QuickTime events, but the QuickTime events in this game are really something else. I mean, they are really terrible. And they also happen under quite tense moments. So you have really tense moments then just the awful QuickTime events appear and it destroys the whole tension, and it's almost comical. The QuickTime events in the game are thankfully quite easy, and this is quite important because the game uses an save system where you only can save at specific locations. Now, I'm not a big fan of this kind of system because it has a tendency of wasting your time, but it works alright in this game because there's quite a lot of save locations, and the game wasn't all that hard, at least the combat part, at the difficulty I played at the very least. But at an early stage in the game I died because of a QuickTime event, and I had to redo a combat section, and that was kind of shitty. And thankfully, as I mentioned before, the QuickTime events are quite easy, because if you were forced to redo entire sections over and over again because of one annoying QuickTime event, that would be quite unforgivable, to say the least. One thing that I did enjoy about the combat was that for a limited amount of time you could sneak past enemies, and I thought that was kind of funny, and it broke up the monotony of just shooting them. So you could sneak past them, or hell, if you wanted to, you can run past them at specific locations, which was kind of nice. And if you got bored of shooting, you could do it the quick way. One annoying thing though was that at certain locations the combat area is very linear and small, and sometimes you can get stuck in enemies or at enemies spawning and so on, which was kind of annoying. One thing that I also should make clear is that this game is not a horror game. I am a complete scaredy cat, and I wasn't frightened once in this game. So don't go into this game expecting a horror game. There might be blood everywhere and so on, but don't do that. Another thing that I probably should mention is that there is an okay weapon selection in the game. There is a couple of different guns and a couple of different melee weapons, which is kind of cool. Sadly though, the difficulty I played it on allowed me to beat almost every level in the game by using the standard gun with limited ammo, which was kind of a shame considering that I didn't use most of the weapons because I tried to save ammo for everything, which probably was a pretty dumb idea considering how much money I had. But if you want a challenge, then you perhaps should play it on higher difficulty. But with that said, then the save system might become a bit more annoying. So yeah, do what you want. But I guess that sums up my thoughts on the combat. And overall, I enjoyed Deadly Premonition. It's not perfect, but it feels like the developers had their ambition and tried to do something. And even though they didn't succeed or make it perfect, still the game do have character. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of games that feels generic and so on. This game is not generic. It has character. It has a lot of flaws as well, but it does have character, which is kind of neat. As I mentioned before, the gameplay is not the greatest. Individually, they are not all that good, and when you put them all together, they aren't. Yeah, it doesn't make a good mix. But I did enjoy all the small, charming stuff in the game. Like you can change your suit, you can change your car, and you can shave, and you have to fuel up your car and so on. And you can fish. I love fishing in video games. The game does have charm. You can't take that away from it. And for some people that will be enough, and for some people it won't. But with that said, I wouldn't recommend anyone paying a whole lot of money for this game, because you can't get away from the fact that the PC version is a broken piece of shit. And I was lucky, even though the crashes and the glitches and so on made my experience worse than it should be. It was still playable, but you might be unlucky. So you should always be quite cautious when the PC version is this bad. So I would not recommend you buying this for any higher price. I bought it when it was cheap as hell, and if you buy it, If you buy a game at cheap price, if it doesn't work, even though it isn't okay, you can still look past it. But if you, yeah, I would not recommend you paying a whole lot of money for this game if this game seems interesting to you. Wait for a sale or a bundle or something like that. But I guess that was my thoughts on the game. If you have watched this far, then thank you for watching this video, and bye bye bye.